when transition into adulthood and what those outcomes look like, and the need to do much more there was the majority of the feedback we got. You'll see when I talk about our mission objectives, that really comes out there too. And the other thing is that you also see, in addition to all the support pieces that are for people today, in every line today, you also see that the dedicated commitment to research stays in there. That research into these causes and better interventions really will remain a core part of our mission. And I know with many of you in the room, that's an initiative near your heart. So that's that change mission statement. And along with that comes our quick impact statement. One of the things that I was talking to staff and we asked them, so what are things we can do? They're having trouble articulating it in a single sentence. And basically for us, to speak is enhancing lives today and accelerating effective solutions for tomorrow. That's what we do. And how do we do that? Well, that's what we do for 5 mission objectives I touched on or mentioned earlier. That's our first mission objective, and you'll see that this ties very closely into the mission statement, is increasing global understanding and acceptance. Autism is a global public health issue that must be addressed. So again, you'll see that pivot to not just awareness, but understanding and acceptance. You'll see that debuted in the language you'll see around April and World Autism in some of the activities and the things we released there. The second mission objective is to be a catalyst for life-enhancing research breakthroughs with a focus on near-term results. And there's a real specific reason for that. I've been in health causes practically my entire career, and there's not one of them that I've worked on as a volunteer, as a staff member, or helping with something that hasn't said, we need more federal funding for research, right? It's a clear example that I know the answer is true. Not just in autism, is there not enough federal funding for research? There's not enough research investment overall in autism. There's not enough profit dollars, there's not enough corporate dollars, and certainly there's not enough federal dollars. So part of that is I think people misunderstood how complex a research issue this was, and certainly that's been learned. And I think it's just something that's still a young issue in the history of disorders and those kind of things. So we think by shining that light on some near-term wins will help bring market capital, if you will, to the rest of the ecosystem. And we're at the place where we can help to do some of that. The other thing is that life enhancing, that it's also about for us a real need to address some of these comorbidities issues, the GI, the seizures, the anxiety, that can bring real-term, short-term relief to people today. And we think that that's an important part of that research agenda as well. The next 2 mission objectives go hand in hand, and they're broken out primarily because we want to stress the importance of each. And the first is one, the third mission objective is one that's very familiar to everybody because it's been a part of what we've done and what you've been working on for so long. And that really is increasing increasing the age of diagnosis and decreasing the time from diagnosis to intervention and making that as quick as possible and as effective as possible. And in this one, there's a special emphasis on lower socioeconomic population because that's where that disparity is the greatest. And we think we've got a special responsibility to really focus there. The fourth mission objective that we've been doing for a while really highlights this as a new area of importance for our organization. And we think from what we've heard from listening to some stakeholders for the entire community, and that really is improving the transition to adulthood and really having successful adulthood outcomes. So we're going to start that work. Simple in concept, not simple in execution. What he did was label single retinal ganglion cells within the eye of these animals, and then he put the animals in a chamber and provided them with an anterior to posterior moving stimulus or a posterior to anterior moving stimulus for 10 hours a day for 4 days. After which he assayed the resolution or the topographic map by mapping out the positions of the labeled retinal ganglion cells within the eye, here, along the nasal to temporal axis, and he mapped out the position of those axon arbors along the rostral caudal axis within the optic septum. And what he found is shown here, where in animals, so on the y-axis is the axon projection site, and on the x-axis is the position of the retinal ganglion cell body. So what we know from this is that temporal retinal ganglion cells project to the rostral portion of the optic septum, and nasal retinal ganglion cells project to the more caudal portion of the optic septum. And when animals receive this anterior to posterior moving stimulus, they establish topography. But when animals receive the posterior to anterior moving stimulus, there is no topography within the projection of the retinal ganglion cell axons. And that means that if there was information sent from the temporal retinal ganglion cells, it would terminate in the same part of the optic septum as retinal ganglion cells from nasal retina communicated information. So there is no topographic information in this projection. And I should say that this is the situation at the beginning of the experiment. So at the first time point, all of the animals had this level, i.e. no topographic information within their map, and the anterior to posterior stimulus allowed them to have this topography, and the posterior to anterior stimulus prevented it. So basically, the way that we think of this is that anterior to posterior motion stimulus enhances the development of the topography, and posterior to anterior degrades it or causes it not to develop. So we think of this basically as a simple example of temporal coding. There's information within the sensory periphery, which is then communicated in a temporal sequence to the retinal ganglion cells in a nasal to temporal, in a temporal to nasal pattern. And it's this activity within the retinal ganglion cells which then communicates the position, the relative position to terminate within the optic septum. So what this meant was that if the retinal ganglion cells in the temporal retina fire first with this anterior to posterior motion stimulus, and that says you terminate, those retinal ganglion cells terminate in the most rostral region of the optic septum, and any ganglion cell that fires next would terminate sequentially more causally within the target area. So we wanted to test whether or not this idea of the temporal sequence of ganglion cells determining where they're going to terminate within the optic septum. And so the way that we tested this was by going back to the dually innervated optic septum model that had been developed before, because we know that if we ablate one optic septum, as shown here on the right, that input from both eyes will terminate in the same septum. And this would allow us to then stimulate the two eyes with very tight temporal intervals between the two eye stimulations and determine whether or not this affected the distribution of axons within the septum. And again, the hypothesis is that whichever eye, the inputs from whichever eye is stimulated first will terminate more rostrally than the inputs from the eye which is stimulated second. And so we labeled the retinal ganglion cells, put them into a little chamber where their eyes were stimulated at either 15 millisecond intervals, 50 millisecond intervals, or longer. And what we found was that when the retinal ganglion cells of the eye that was stimulated first, they would shift towards more rostral positions within the optic septum, and the inputs that were stimulated second would shift to relatively more caudal positions. And so we call this a spatial to temporal to spatial transformation. And basically, the reason why we think this is important is because it would ensure that retinal ganglion cells' axons would terminate across the entire target area and not be squished up into the rostral portion of the optic septum, as would be predicted from spike-time-dependent toxicity rules. So here what you see is that the retinal ganglion cells would be activated in sequence, and according to the sequential activity pattern, they would terminate in a topographic manner. So just to compare this, what we're calling this spatial to temporal to spatial transformation, the FTS, with the heavy coactivity rule, what Hess said is all that really matters is whether or not you're coactive. And if the inputs are coactive, they will be strengthened onto the same target cells. So what we would like to add to that is that it really depends on the sequence of the input activity. And if they are coactive and offset by a certain temporal interval, then they will be adopted in order within the target area. And again, why is this important? It's because spike-time-dependent plasticity would shift the topographic map towards one end of the target area, and the FTS rule would ensure that this is spread out over time. So let's just look at this and see if we have activity going along this dimension. According to the spike-time-dependent plasticity rule, the retinal ganglion cells that are activated first would capture all the territory, and they would have strong synapses with all of those targets. But the FTS rule now would ensure that these connections are spread evenly from each input across the target area. I think this is interesting in light of recent work looking at spontaneous waves of activity in the retina, where we now know that these spontaneous waves originate in temporal retina and spread to nasal retina. And recent work in Michael Prayer's lab has demonstrated that these spontaneous waves moving from temporal to nasal retina are present in the ganglion cell axons within the superior colliculus, and you can see that there's a wave of activity from rostral to caudal superior colliculus, both in the axons and in their postsynaptic cells. So I think that this is basically a conserved mechanism that organizes these topographic maps. So, to summarize this part of the story, what we've shown is that the temporal order of convergent input activity is a source of information which organizes topographic maps, and the spatial information which is embedded in the natural visual scene in the form of optic flow is translated into a temporal code in the sequence of retinal ganglion cell firing, and that this temporal activity is then transformed into the spatial map of within the topographic map. And the reason I think that this FTS rule cooperates with spike-time-dependent plasticity rules. Spike-time-dependent plasticity rules are still very important in terms of allowing an animal to anticipate a response to a frequently observed input, but the FTS rule will counteract the negative consequences that spike-time-dependent plasticity has on topography. So that story was all about axons and topography and completely ignored the other part of the story, which is basically that they're temporal neurons and that they're the ones who are processing this information. And so now I'd like to talk a little bit about experience-dependent properties of inhibitory neurons, and this was a project done by Hai-Han He in my lab. So the postsynaptic cells, the central neurons, can be imaged beautifully in these neurons by using methods of single-cell or sparse electroporation. And what you see here in this, on the right are a series of two-photon images through the depth of the object tectum. What you see here now is the reconstruction of that same cell, and we can look closely at the dendritic arbor structure and how that changes over time during development and in response to visual input. When we collect time-lapse images in an intact animal here at every 2 hours over a period of about 8 hours, it's interesting that the dendritic arbor doesn't really change a lot at this time scale, but over a time course of days, you see that the arbor elaborates. And we spent a lot of time investigating why there's so much dynamic in a short time frame without any net growth. Another way of looking at that is shown here, where in these optic tectal neurons, images collected every 10 minutes over a period of hours show that basically every process is dynamic. But remember, these animals are forming connections, they're processing visual information. So we wanted to understand how visual experience modifies the growth and plasticity of these neurons. And inspired again by Struble and Wiesel, we provided them with visual experience, and where we put them into a chamber where over the top of the chamber there was a panel of LEDs that were moving at a constant rate. And again, in a very simple experiment, we found that by imaging single neurons, and I'm showing you two examples here and here, by imaging single neurons over time, we found that when animals are placed, so what we do is we collect an image of the neuron in the intact animal, we take him off the stage of the scope, he swims around, and in the first 4-hour period, he's just sitting there in the dark, and then we collect another image. And you may see that the structure of the dendritic arbor doesn't really change a lot over this 4-hour period in the dark, but when the animal is now brought up out of anesthesia and put into a chamber with that stimulated motion stimulus, the dendritic arbor elaborates quite a bit. And so we did a number of experiments to identify many of the molecular and cellular processes that are involved in the visual stimulation-induced structural plasticity. Among others, we know that visual stimulation increases segmental synaptogenesis and increases the strength of the synaptic contacts by trafficking of AMPA receptors into those sites. So what we find, again, just to summarize these early studies, that immature neurons have very sparsely arborized dendritic arbors, and two things happen over the course of the development. The arbor gets more complex, and AMPA receptors are added to these synapses. And we were interested in dissecting whether or not AMPA receptors were, whether the arbor just grew and added and strengthened synapses, or if glutamatergic synaptic activity was actually important in the elaboration of the dendritic arbor. To address this question, we interfered with AMPA receptor trafficking into synapses and found that these neurons had a very different dendritic arbors, that they didn't develop mature synaptic contact, and in fact they didn't respond to this simulated motion stimulus with an increase in dendritic arbor elaboration. So for instance, in the green bars, you see an increase in total dendritic branch length with visual stimulation compared to the chart, but in animals that had been, where the AMPA receptor trafficking had been blocked, these animals now, or these neurons, didn't show an enhancement in dendritic arbor growth in response to the visual stimulation. So in those experiments, we just went in blind and labeled and imaged cells independent of what kind of neuron they were. And so Hai-Han He was interested in testing whether or not excitatory and inhibitory neurons respond differently to visual experience. And the way that she did this was first by collecting time-lapse images of the neurons in the animal and determine whether or not they were excitatory or inhibitory neurons by using post-hoc immunocytochemistry for GABA. And part of the reason why we did this was that these neurons, they express GABA, we can identify them according to that immunoreactivity, but they don't express classical calcium binding proteins that inhibitory neurons express later on in development. So, and they also, according to studies that Corliss Eisenman has done, they don't have electrophysiological properties that would distinguish them from excitatory neurons. So when Hai-Han lined up all the inhibitory neurons and all the excitatory neurons that she had imaged, we couldn't identify any morphological difference between these two classes of cells. So by biomarkers, by biochemical markers, by morphology, by electrophysiological properties, these neurons, the excitatory and inhibitory neurons, appear completely uniform at this relatively early stage of development. But we also knew, as I had told you, that this is a circuit that is seeing and processing visual information. So Hai-Han resorted to testing whether or not these neurons would behave differently. So this now classical dark light visual stimulation protocol, and examined whether or not how the inhibitory neurons responded. And what you see here are, this is again the change in total branch tip number and change in total dendritic length, and you look at these data and it's like, oh my heavens. I mean, you see huge variation, and so what that meant to us right away was that this population of inhibitory neurons is extremely heterogeneous. And then what you see in in this panel is when Haiyan plotted the data so that she distinguished the growth rate of the dendritic arbor in response to visual stimulation and the changing growth rate that occurred when the animals were in the dark, then we see something very interesting that was quite distinct from the excitatory neurons that we had seen before. So neurons that increased their dendritic arbor growth rate with visual stimulation got smaller in the dark. And then there was another, and that's what classically the excitatory neurons do. But then we see this population of neurons where their dendritic arbor plasticity, structural plasticity, increased in the dark and decreased with visual stimulation. So for us, this was a total shock and suggested to us that there might be two classes of inhibitory neurons that had these different plasticity responses to visual experience. And so Haiyan used this clustering strategy and was able to distinguish two groups of inhibitory neurons which behave in opposite ways in response to the dark and the visual stimulation. So this is the clustering, and again, this is that same plot that I just showed you, but now according to the clustering, these are separated into two different groups, and now what we see is they behave very nicely as two completely different groups with relatively little heterogeneity, where one group gets smaller in the dark and grows a lot with the visual experience, and the other enhances its structural plasticity in the dark and gets smaller with the visual stimulation. These two cell types are completely overlapping, so they're not segregated in any way within the optic septum. So the reason why the dendritic arbor is basically a proxy for looking at synaptic inputs, because each little branch within the dendrite is basically like a spine in hippocampal neurons, where it's the site of the synaptic input. So when there's an increase in dendritic arbor branches, that's a proxy for an increase in synaptic contacts, and when there's fewer branches, it's a proxy for a decrease in synaptic contacts. So now Haiyan wanted to look at what about the output of the cell. And so we know that we can use calcium imaging because the magnitude of the calcium response correlates with the number of action potentials that the cell fires. So here what we see is, again, using the same dark light protocol, we find that neurons show differences in their calcium responses, and they fall into two groups. So again, the protocol here is provide a visual stimulus to the animal and collect the calcium responses in response to that visual stimulus, put the animal into the dark, and then collect another calcium response and test whether or not it's altered as a result of the animal being in the dark, and then provide the animal with visual experience and collect another response. And what we find is, again, here, that neurons fall into two different groups, some of which potentiate their response to the visual stimulus as a result of the short-term visual experience that we show, and others depress their responses to the visual experience. And again, here it breaks down those two different groups. And so what these experiments indicate to us that there are two groups of inhibitory neurons, and they change both their input and their output in opposite ways in response to the short-term visual experience. Now, we were interested in what would happen to the balance of inhibition and excitation. What difference does this make for the circuit, basically, if you have these two classes of inhibitory neurons that might counterbalance one another? And so what we did was test what the effect of this short-term visual experience was on the E-to-I balance when we record from optic septal neurons in the intact animal. And what we found was that animals that had been treated with a short-term visual experience for 4 hours, they had potentiated excitatory and inhibitory responses, as you see here in these examples, and here for the population of neurons from which we recorded. But importantly, the ratio of excitatory to inhibitory input was not different as a result of this short-term visual experience. So basically, the E-to-I balance in the optic septum was preserved, and the plasticity kept this E-to-I balance. Okay, so how could that work? So basically what we were trying to do a bunch of little six-figure cartoons of what kind of circuit might allow for two different classes, two opposite functional classes of inhibitory neurons and a single class of excitatory neurons that would allow for a balance of inhibition to excitation. And just to jump to our conclusion, what we propose is that excitatory input to the postsynaptic cell is balanced by a feed-forward disinhibitory connectivity map or connection between the group 2 inhibitory neurons synapsing onto the group 1 inhibitory neurons. So basically, this little cartoon would accommodate these two classes of inhibitory neurons, and that they would work together in order to maintain the excitatory to inhibitory balance within the optic septum in response to visual experience. And so what this indicates to us is that we've identified at this early stage of development, prior to the time when there are morphological or biochemical clues to distinguish these two types of inhibitory neurons, they cluster according to their responses, their plasticity responses to visual input. And we think that these two classes of inhibitory neurons operate to maintain stability in the circuit at a time when there's a lot of dynamic rearrangement of neurons. We think that these two groups of inhibitory neurons are clear and functionally apparent prior to the expression of